Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. There are public interest groups for Mexican Americans, Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, and just about every other ethnic group besides Israeli Americans. That is, until Dylan Hosier founded ICANN, Israeli American Civic Action Network. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Wanatik. I'm the CEO of Solution Nation and Douglas in the Desert. We have a very interesting session today. We have Dylan Hosier with us. He is the chairman and chief executive officer of the Israeli American Civic Action Network. Dylan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, David. So happy to be here with you.
So many of us are not aware of what the Israeli American Civic Action Network does or what its mission is. Maybe you can just give us an overview of that.
Sure. So ICANN, the Israeli American Civic Action Network, is actually a new pro-Israel advocacy network. Just to give a little bit of a background on me, I previously worked for the Israeli government, serving as the political officer for the Israeli consulate under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Los Angeles. And in that time, I noticed that every other immigrant community we're based in Los Angeles, by the way, every other immigrant community has an advocacy organization, has a vehicle to engage with elected officials and advocate for policies and legislation that would support their community and address their interests. But there was a big gap in terms of the Israeli American community. And in fact, I had noticed in the Jewish community broadly that there's kind of there was almost an expectation that Israelis not be involved in the civic life in America, that it was too complicated. It was too big, too unwieldy for an Israeli to understand. And so we established ICANN contrary to that. We established ICANN with the belief that Israelis absolutely should play a role in civic life in America, that Israelis, probably above all other people in other communities in the United States, have the best perspective on Israel and how important it is for the United States and Israel to have a relationship. So to me, it's actually an honor. I think Israel and the United States are two of the best countries on earth. And to be able to help a great people from a great country like Israel come to this country and serve and represent their community is really an honor to do this kind of work.
Great. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of course, Jewish organizations in the United States and pro-Israeli organizations in the United States. But before your organization started, I don't think there was anything specifically for Israeli Americans.
Right.
All the other ethnic groups seem to have their own organizations, pro-Chinese or Filipinos,
sure,
or what have you. So this is very interesting. What specific issues do you tend to support in your organization?
So what's interesting, I think, about our approach, and again, when we looked at the advocacy landscape in the United States, number one, we noticed that the traditional models of pro-Israel advocacy seemed to be losing their traction when it came to, especially Congress. And I think we see with the squad growing in rank there in the House. I expect, by the way, we're already looking at 2024. I know we just got past the last election, but it looks like that's going to grow. And so when you look at the landscape of advocacy organizations, you can look at the Latino groups, for example, and look at the issues that they address. And more often than not, actually, most immigrant organizations, you mentioned China, I think, they deal with both domestic issues and foreign policy issues. So domestic, because these are immigrant communities, and immigrant communities have unique challenges and demands. English as a second language, the quality of public schools. Many who come here for the first time aren't able to send their kids to private schools, and so public education is a vital issue. So when we have things like ethnic studies that marginalizes Jews and paints a completely defamatory and false picture of Israel, these are domestic issues that we have to get involved in. But of course, Israelis are very concerned about foreign policy issues as well. So if it's foreign policy and defense related to international peace and security in the Middle East and throughout the broader North Africa region, then that's an important thing to work for, as well as obviously foreign aid for Israel and things like that. So I think we're unique also in that aspect, that we deal with both domestic issues, things like education, anti-Semitism. By the way, BDS. The role that BDS plays in American life, frankly, we see that as a civil rights issue. It's not just an issue of who we support in terms of our friends abroad, in terms of Israel being an ally, but BDS has a corrosive effect on Jewish life here in the United States, and especially Israelis who live here, who feel like when you boycott Israel, you're boycotting them and you're fostering an environment of bigotry. So that's kind of interesting too about our organization, that we don't just do foreign policy, we don't just do domestic issues. We see a nexus between the two, especially in this immigrant community of Israelis.
Great. So in connection with ethnic studies, what have you found to be very troubling, and how have you combated that?
Yeah, so ethnic studies is really it's an interesting issue. On the face of it, and if you actually look at the authorizing or in some cases mandatory language of the legislation that requires ethnic studies to be taught in our public schools, it seems very innocuous. It seems incredibly innocuous, and only in the implementation of the language and of the bill does the problem tend to crop up. So if you look at California, which I think is probably the most egregious example, an ethnic studies bill was passed in 2016, signed by then Governor Jerry Brown. And to us, we initially supported it because to us, this is seen as an opportunity to teach other people about American Jewish life, immigrant Jewish life, whether you're from Israel, Iran, the former Soviet Union, or elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. We saw this as an opportunity to engage and to educate others who may not be aware of what Jewish life is like, or Jewish history is like. Unfortunately, some radical folks kind of got themselves appointed to a commission at the state level, and they drafted something that was unrecognizable in terms of anything that might have any grounding in fact or basis in history or anything. It was a document that was basically meant to marginalize other groups in an effort to lift up, I suppose, other marginalized or other apparently marginalized groups. And if I sound like my tongue is tied, it is, because the language that was used in this curriculum that was drafted was also unrecognizable. The LA Times criticized it, and the LA Times is not known for being a bastion of conservative thought or even sometimes moderate thought. The LA Times criticized the ethnic studies curriculum as too full of jargon and difficult to even understand because some of the language they used was so off base. So what we had to do when we saw this draft curriculum containing pro-BDS messaging, anti-Jewish messaging, or just outright anti-Semitic messaging, and also anti-Israeli messaging too, by the way. Oftentimes we see activists who are anti-Israel claim that they're only anti-Israeli government and those who are in charge. But we saw in this curriculum that they really advocated effectively for, in their view, collective punishment in Israel for, again, what they would call offenses against the Palestinian people. And we, of course, disagree with that and think that, again, there's no basis in fact there. And so we advocated that the bill be delayed, the implementation of the bill be delayed while the curriculum was redrafted. The anti-Israel stuff was removed. At that point, we really kind of took a step back once the anti-Israel stuff was removed, and there were other folks in the Jewish community throughout California who had put in new curricula about Ashkenazi American Jewish life, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, it ended up in an okay place statutorily, but it's still a fight that's ongoing in the United States. Most recently, I mean, this is happening right now. We're finding that despite the fact that the fringe curriculum was removed, these advocates are trying to kind of backdoor it through the community college system here in California. So I think that depending where you are in the United States, you can look to California as kind of a canary in the coal mine on ethnic studies to see what activists, what tactics and strategies activists are using to try to push this radical and fringe perspective of different ethnicities in the United States.
As far as textbooks that have been published and used, are there any specific instances you can tell us about where Israel is cast in a negative or inaccurate light?
So in terms of specific textbooks, no. We had seen, I can't think of it now. I mean, there were certainly textbooks that were referenced in that curriculum. If anybody's interested, they can go to the California Department of Education. I believe the draft curriculum is still published there, and you can look at it yourself and see the material that was being advocated for. Much of it wasn't necessarily in a textbook, but maybe it's in PDF reading assignments that professors or others had drafted to make these available to students. And by the way, these are not just college students. This is for high school, and even they're now trying to push even younger than high school to learn some of this stuff. So they use not just textbooks, but like I said, other articles and papers and briefs. Interestingly, though, they also use multimedia. So whether it's podcasts or videos or documentaries, they're pushing those too. So there's really a wide gamut of media that they use to try to push their in our view, anti-Semitic message.
Has any other group been cast in such a consistently bad light? Any other ethnic group portrayed unattractively?
Generally, I would say probably the United States and Israel are in good company in that regard. There is a thread of anti-American attitudes, it seems, that runs through this effort to push a radical version of ethnic studies. So I would say that probably there's a distorted view of American history and of Americans in general. But in terms of another immigrant community in the United States, no, I would say this is uniquely targeting the Jewish community and the diverse aspects of the Jewish community as well.
So how specifically did ICON try to change some of the curriculum? Was it proposing alternative curriculum or pointing out the inaccurate or slanderous or libelous parts of the text that were used?
Yeah, so we again, we really it's an interesting story. Now that you're asking me a good probing question, it was very interesting because in the beginning of this issue with ethnic studies, at least here in California, there were many different groups involved from many different political ideologies and parts of the political spectrum, from left to right and everywhere in between. What was concerning to us, and this is again from the Jewish community side, from organizations that are ostensibly Zionist or pro-Israel, there was a chatter that we would be okay leaving the anti-Israel material in as long as there is a discussion and a recognition of anti-Semitism as a form of hate or as a vector for hate, and as long as the curriculum would be updated to include the histories of Ashkenazi Jews who had come to the United States. For us, that was unacceptable. We weren't going to trade away an acceptance of a denigration of Israel or a delegitimization of Israel in order to elevate or include aspects of the American Jewish community. And so we fought, frankly, even in that dynamic, when others were willing to let the BDS content stay. We were not willing to allow that to us. And I think this is where you get into the unique aspects of ICANN. And by the way, just for listeners who may be unfamiliar or who may be familiar even with the Israeli community, we named it ICANN intentionally because we wanted Israelis to feel like I can get involved and I can get engaged in civics and that kind of thing. So it's meant to be an aspirational, inspirational name as well. But at ICANN, we did not accept this notion that BDS should be included. And so as I said, this gives you a unique perspective about the role that we can play in this kind of arena where, for an American, sure, maybe it's okay to let the Israel stuff in there because it's okay to criticize Israel, and maybe there's a belief that it's deserved or whatever. I don't know what the thinking is, but to an Israeli, leaving that content in is, I think, an existential kind of threat in a way, because imagine the Israeli student who has to go to school and listen to that false material and have a complex conversation with his classmates or a hostile teacher. So we really said, look, from the Israeli perspective, this is unacceptable, whereas others didn't care about the Israeli perspective. And so I think that was our unique role to play, was we're drawing the line. We're not going to accept leaving the pro-BDS material in exchange for pro-broad Jewish material. So once that was done, we considered it a success, but we're still monitoring vigilantly the effort, because there is an organized group called the Liberated Ethnic Studies Movement, I think it's called, that are trying to push this liberated version of ethnic studies through any way possible.
So when you're actually doing the lobbying for the ethnic studies or the BDS issue or Iranian issue maybe, or foreign aid, does it primarily consist of meetings with lawmakers? Is it public outreach, getting the press involved, the Israeli American community to write letters, or what kind of tactics do you find pay off the best?
So that's a super interesting question, and it's a question I wish that more in this space would ask, because I think we're leaving a lot on the table when it comes to advocacy and pushing our agenda and our viewpoint. So most often, the kind of the bread and butter are meetings with elected officials. Believe it or not, while we were ramping up, we actually had instances where, when we were having these meetings, even with Jewish legislators, by the way, you know what they said? They said, I didn't even think that I had Israelis in my district. I didn't even think I had Israelis as a constituency. And these were Jewish legislators who were seasoned Jewish legislators. And so we really tried to, again, introduce this concept that, yes, Israelis exist, and they're not just the people with the funny accents you might run into on the high holidays. They're a part of the community, and they have to get involved and get engaged. So the meetings and the face-to-face are super important, and the face-to-face is important as well, because I had an example in Nevada once when we were advocating for legislation, and we had a Latino legislator who seemed to be pro BDS, didn't really know what BDS was, and for those listening, BDS is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement that seeks to delegitimize and erase Israel from the map. but once he met Israelis and once he saw the diversity of the kinds of people that come from Israel, by the way, from Ethiopian Israelis to Yemenites and Moroccan. I actually had an Ethiopian community member I was able to take to the capital, meet with him. And that opened his eyes and totally changed his viewpoint and perspective. And that legislator in subsequent legislative sessions, if you go to his office, you'll find an Israeli flag on his desk. So the meetings and the face-to-face are super important. And during COVID, we launched just before COVID, by the way, the organization. But during COVID, it was very difficult. We got to only do Zoom meetings, but at least I got to do some face-to-face. But the person-to-person meetings, whether it's at the Capitol, back east in DC, or the state capitol, or even city councils, the face-to-face meeting are face-to-face is most important. And then, of course, nothing beats an old-fashioned letter. I guess old-fashioned in this case is email, but an email to your legislator or your elected official, your public representative is invaluable. And we've had campaigns where we've had to mobilize thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of letters to affect change. So I would say in person and the letter writing is the most effective. But underlying and again what connects these tactics and strategies is that Israelis in America who live here and who work here and who are building their life here should feel free to let their voice be heard and tell their story and tell their connection to Israel to their elected officials, because that's the best way, in our view, for an elected official in America to get to know Israel. It's through their Israeli constituents in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Unfortunately, there's a lot of racism, and the racism comes from the left, solely judging people by the color of their skin. But if that's the only thing that people understand on the left, then I think what you're doing as far as demonstrating that Israel is a ethnically diverse country, as you mentioned, there's Ethiopian Jews, there's Jews from countries that have been oppressed. You talk about the Yemenites and Moroccans, and
Absolutely.
maybe very recently Ukrainians. Ukrainian Jews are moving to Israel. A few years ago, there was even more anti-Semitism in France. So now you have a large French-speaking community in Israel. So it's a very diverse community. Maybe further on the issue of BDS, I think this was one of the tactics you used, right? In BDS is you brought ethnically diverse Israelis to the attention of legislatures that wanted to implement BDS, and say, if you implement BDS, you're going to hurt, people, of African origin and
correct,
and so on.
Yeah, that's right. Again, I think it's easy. So if you think back, or if you look, even I'm thinking back, probably it's very persistent. The pro-Israel or in the Israel advocacy space is largely populated by Americans, people who have their heritages from here. They speak perfect English. They understand the American political system, but most importantly, they choose their relationship with Israel. And I'm one of them, by the way. I'm an American who chose my relationship with Israel, and so I have a privilege and a convenience of being able to do that. Israelis don't have that privilege or that convenience. They will always be Israeli. In many cases, they will be easy to identify as Israeli, whether it's through hearing them speak Hebrew or their accent or some other way. And so it's important to have those folks have their voices heard and have them be represented. And it's interesting because we find that legislators, to me, it's almost cowardly, right? If you're going to take a position on an issue without hearing both sides, or at least, do some of these people ever meet an Israeli, or do they think that Israel is an easy box to check on an endorsement questionnaire or whatever, so they can score far left Democratic Socialists of America political points? And what we're saying is, hey, before you take a position, to stop, meet the people that you're affecting, and then decide. And 9 times out of 10, I'll have to struggle to find and to think of someone who wasn't moved by at least meeting the people and hearing their stories. 9 times out of 10, a legislator will think again about their support for BDS. I think that's a super powerful asset in the pro-Israel space, especially when you consider that it wasn't too long ago that Israelis who left Israel and set up a life in America were considered Yordim, or the opposite of making Aliyah. And so that stigma has finally, I think, gone away mostly. And the diverse voices and diverse faces are really shifting, I think, the dynamic. And by the way, it's not just in Congress, but it's also, as I mentioned before, in your state legislature or city council. When we see members of Congress who are anti-Israel, they didn't just appear one day and decide they're going to run for Congress. They most often came from their state legislature, or they came up through their city council. And so it's important for us to engage where we can. And so we're actually present as an organization. We specifically targeted places that were tough places to work. So as I mentioned, we're in California. I'm in the city of Los Angeles. We're also in Nevada and in Las Vegas, Seattle, Washington, and Boston, Massachusetts. Those are not easy places. Vegas is probably the easiest, and Nevada is the easiest of those places, but the rest are very difficult in terms of the local and state governments. But because of the work that you mentioned, bringing Israelis to public meetings or to City Hall, state legislatures, and so on, we've actually made California one of the most pro-Israel states in the country. And that's probably unexpected and counterintuitive, but California has some of the strongest Iran sanctions legislation still on the books, still in effect. The state has adopted an anti-BDS legislation. There's a unique MOU between Israel and California that I actually had the privilege of leading and drafting when I worked at the government. So this has been a proven kind of method and track record, and it's been very effective over the past several years.
Do you find it? Where do you find it most effective to lobby at a very localized level, such as a city council, or at a larger level, such as a U.S. congressional district? I'd imagine, like in a congressional district, probably more of a chance that you have American Israelis in that congressional district, whereas city council, maybe you don't have any Israelis, or almost no Israelis in a small city's council, but you maybe have more access to the council members.
You made the case, yeah. That's kind of the trade-off that we have to work with. I actually find, that being said, I mean, in controlling for those differences, I actually find Congress easier to work with, not because of the population or because you might have a larger opportunity or probability of finding an Israeli, but there's 535 members of Congress, right? There's 435 in the House, 100 senators. That's a manageable number to work with, the 535. But you've got thousands of legislators across the country, and even more city council members. So it's a huge population. And interestingly, and depending where you are, and this is something that I discovered, is that the opposition groups, the usual suspects, the Jewish Voice for Peace and groups like this, the Council for American Islamic Relations, typically is opposed to many of our pro-Israel policies. They have a get there first strategy. So whether it's a city council member or state legislator or wherever, whatever the venue is, it's almost whoever gets there first and makes that initial impression of whatever agenda they're trying to push, whether it's something about the Middle East or something here domestically. Whoever gets there first really kind of wins the argument. And so we really tried to, no matter where the venue is get there first. But I would say that, you're right. Congress is a bit easier to work with for many different reasons. But I would say that there's more reward for the high risk and the intense engagement that you have to do at the local and state level you kind of get more out of it, and it pays off in dividends as that person moves through their political career. So we really do try to engage deeply and consistently at the local and state level, as opposed to Congress.
So in general, which way do you see the BDS movement going now? Is it getting stronger? Is it less influential than it was a few years ago? And then if there's anything else you'd like to say about your contention that BDS is actually a violation of civil rights.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question about the effectiveness of BDS, and I think that and the prominence and all that. It depends on how you're looking at it. BDS has never been effective, at undermining the Israeli economy. I mean, not BDS, not even wars or conflicts started by Hamas or Hezbollah or whoever have been able to injure the Israeli economy. So BDS certainly isn't really doing it. Now, there is a risk. That said, there is a risk that you do have primarily financial institutions, this kind of ESG approach to investing that I think we're going to see. I think we're really going to see BDS morph into this ESG investing space. We really have to watch that very closely. I think they're adapting and morphing into that area in order to push their agenda. So while I think that from a foreign perspective, BDS has been largely ineffective, BDS has been very effective at undermining, I think, Jewish life and safety in the United States. And most specifically, it has been very effective at undermining Israeli American life and safety in the United States. So it becomes much less about what happens there and more really about what happens here in service of a supposed larger agenda. So it's hard to say. So from that standpoint, there are constant efforts and movements that are frankly rooted in anti-Semitism. I mean, this notion that it's free political speech, that it's sure, it's free speech, but it can also be discriminatory and bigoted speech as well, that has the effect of marginalizing and disenfranchising a community of immigrants. And so I think that's the message that we need to be highlighting and spreading in venues, whether it's in government or primarily, obviously, the problem, as we know, is on colleges and university campuses. So I think that BDS, again, foreign has never really been effective. I think that BDS is still persistent here in the United States, primarily on the college campuses, to a certain extent in other schools. But that being said, there was a time back kind of in the 2015, almost 10 years ago, where BDS was really surging in the United States. From 2011 to 2015, there was this 4-year period where it was really surging, and we were seeing it metastasize beyond campus and universities to labor unions, to shareholder meetings. There was an effort to have people buy stocks in Cisco and Google and Amazon and have them move their, at shareholder meetings, demand that they move their facilities outside of Israel. So it really was metastasizing. So the community over the past several years, and this is a credit to the Jewish community broadly and the pro-Israel community, coast to coast, and all the organizations, really pushed back against this movement and kind of held the line back to keep BDS on campuses and schools. But our students are still suffering. I like to say it's unfortunate that today it's not safe to be Israeli and study in an American university, or Jewish for that matter. And this is to me, we often hear in the African American community, it's not safe to be Black while driving. Well, what we'd like to say, it's not safe to study while being Jewish on these American campuses in some cases. And so that is a fundamentally civil rights issue. There seems to be a strange kind of expectation that or belief or perspective that Jews are part of the white structure oppressing Black, Indigenous people of color. And obviously we think that's nonsense. And that's part of the reason why, by the way, we need to show the diversity of Jews and that certainly Jews are not part of that, if even if you do believe that it exists. And so we find that these anti-Israel advocates and pro-BDS advocates actually today, bizarrely enough, for how they claim to be progressive and liberal and tolerant and so on and so forth, they're actually adopting the same language and rhetoric and talking points that those who were opposed to the 1964 Civil Rights Act used back then, when that was being considered in Congress. So we like to remind people of that, and we like to remind people that anti-Semitism is real and that it is a vector that actually does attack Jews in many different ways, not just religious discrimination, but yes, there is such a thing as national origin anti-Semitic discrimination that targets people from Israel, and that's a case that we like to make. So insofar as BDS does undermine and like I said, corrode the foundations of our community, it is still effective here in the United States from that standpoint.
So if you believe that the civil rights of Jewish people or American Israelis are being systemically violated at places like campuses, is there any group that is pursuing litigation? And maybe that's beyond the scope of ICANN, but are you aware of that tactic? Yeah.
So yes, and that's not something we do. We kind of if you look at the workflow of law, we're kind of upstream where we try to shape a law that's on the books to help the lawyers downstream be more effective in their cases. So yes, absolutely. There are now cases, and largely it was thanks to President Trump's executive order on anti-Semitism, where he did highlight, and if you read the executive order, he really was reminding people that, hey, anti-Semitism rooted in national origin, he specifically called this out in his executive order, is a thing. It's real and it exists. And it's interesting because even today, if you look at the people who oppose, for example, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an international intergovernmental organization of countries, of member states. This is an organization that was formed by treaty. They have created a internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism that includes delegitimization of Israel. And I think this is an important thing, because if you believe that when Trump talked about the wall and that he was racist and bigoted when he talked about immigration and building the wall, then we would say to those people, if you believe that, then you should also believe that BDS is discriminatory and seeks to undermine immigrants and people of color who happen to be Jewish and Israeli. So I think that that's a case that lawyers have made, and in recent years, the past 2-3 years, some of these Title VI, which is the Civil Rights Act, part of the Civil Rights Act that governs this aspect of discrimination, they have made successful complaints, and many universities have had to settle or make some sort of remuneration to the students who are victimized.
Okay, so we're running out of time. So just one or two more quick questions.
Sure.
Anything you want to say as far as what ICANN is doing vis-a-vis the Iranian threat? And then the second part of that, you did mention that perhaps you lobby for foreign aid towards Israel. Address those issues.
Yeah, so the foreign aid question I'll take first. We generally support on that issue. I think it's important to recognize our friends and colleagues, and on the issue of foreign aid, AIPAC really is the leading organization in that regard. They do a phenomenal job of advocating for that piece of legislation, so we support them in that effort. I would say, just to kind of expand your question maybe a little bit, we do also, as an organization, prioritize and support other legislation that deepens the U.S.-Israel relationship. So where that foreign aid bill, that 3.3 billion that we give to Israel, that by the way is spent on American material and military equipment, Raytheon and Lockheed and so on. So we obviously support that, but there are other things too, like the past couple of Congresses, there's been the U.S.-Israel PTSD Collaboration Act that we supported. This would have created, it hasn't passed yet, but hopefully it will pass soon. This will create a fund that the Department of Defense can use to grant money to nonprofit institutions that cooperate with Israel on PTSD. We know Israel is the best, it's the world leader on PTSD research and treatment. And so if we can bring some of that research here to the United States to help treat our veterans, our soldiers, our law enforcement, first responders, that's a great thing. So we support legislation like that as well, in addition to the foreign aid. On Iran, we actually kind of take our own advice. And we have been working largely with the large Persian population here in Los Angeles, and kind of teaching them the same tricks that we've been working to teach the Israeli American community. And so it's interesting to see Israelis and Persian Jews working together. Israelis telling the story about how, or telling their, it's not a story, it's facts about how Iran has been working to wipe Israel off the map, and that's how it affects Israelis uniquely. But Persian Jews have a unique story to tell too. They talk about having to leave and flee and the country after the fall of the Shah, and they have unique experience and perspective. And so we try to bring them to the forefront to tell their story, and to really talk about the dangers of the Iran deal and how risky that is to international peace and security, not just in the region, but throughout the world, even here in Los Angeles. So we frankly just kind of teach our colleagues in the Persian Jewish community our same approach, and we allow them to use our platform to do that. And so we have found that to be very effective in opening people's eyes about the threat of what's happening in Iran.
Okay, that's very interesting how you use the Persian community to help with the Iranian issue. Anyway, the last questions, a little bit about the organization. How is it structured? To what extent do you use volunteers? Are you more structured on the issues or on the different cities and states?
So it's a blend. It's a blend of both. And remind me, what was the first question again you asked?
I just made a comment that it's interesting how you are using the Persian community.
Oh yeah, right. And so you're asking how is the organization organized? So first of all, so geographically, we really our secret sauce really is working at the state and local level. We do things in Congress. We do support federal bills, and mainly some of the federal work we're doing is to support state and local efforts as well. And as I mentioned, we purposefully tried to start in difficult places like Seattle and Olympia and Boston and so forth. So the geography does matter, and it was intentional. But we really are anchored as an organization around 6 core themes, if you will. And in each of those kind of thematic agenda items, there may be many different specific pieces of legislation or resolutions or policies or whatever that we're trying to advocate for. And we have it, 3 are in foreign policy and 3 are in domestic policy. On the foreign side, it's promoting the Abraham Accords. We believe the Abraham Accords are an incredibly important instrument, not just abroad, but also here at home, because what we're doing is, rather than having elected officials focus on, and I'm watching the clock, I won't take too much time, but rather than have elected officials focus on BDS, let's focus on where the real peace is happening. BDS is not a peaceful movement. It's nothing about peace. Abraham Accords are. And so we are really trying to educate folks at the local and state level about the value and the virtue of the Abraham Accords. You mentioned preventing a nuclear Iran, and the other one here, I happen to have a handy dandy brochure. So the other one is obviously strengthening the U.S.-Israel alliance. On the domestic side, we like to focus on on expanding and protecting Holocaust education. So expanding means mandating Holocaust education in public schools. Protecting it means ensuring it's taught correctly and it doesn't fall prey to the ethnic studies curriculum. Because, by the way, there are efforts to ethnic studyize our Holocaust education in America. That's a real thing. Domestically, also combating anti-Semitism and hate. One of our signature efforts we did here in California, we created a commission on the state of hate to help combat anti-Semitism before it starts. And so that was fully funded by a $1.8 million grant by the state of California and Governor Newsom. And then finally, strengthening advocacy on campus. One of the things that we worked on recently was an effort at the second largest school district in America, which happens to be in Los Angeles, LAUSD. The teachers union there wanted to endorse formally BDS and use it as a method of teaching the Middle East in classrooms. And we, for the first time, kind of waded into the education space after ethnic studies in a way that was very unexpected. And we lobbied the union and won the vote, actually. So we were able to get the rank and file teachers to understand and agree. And we used that perspective of, hey, if you support BDS, think about the Israeli students who are in your classroom and how you're going to make them feel. This isn't about a country on the other side of the world. This is about the students who are in your classroom today and tomorrow. So think of it that way. So those are the core issue areas. And like I said, there may be many things that fall under each of those, but those are broadly the issue areas that we focus on.
Well, Dylan, we very much appreciate the great work you're doing. You're a real pioneer. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of Jewish organizations in the United States and pro-Israeli organizations, but ICON's really the first one that stands up for the Israeli Americans. So really appreciate the work you're doing. We're amazed that you get so much done with such a small team. From lobbying different city councils to state legislators to U.S. officials, and on so many different issues, and to do it so well, it's really amazing. So very much appreciate your dedication to the cause. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David. I'm so happy to be here with you.